And what I've realized is there's a 5-step process that anyone can follow. I'll be honest, this industry's changed my life.
What's up, guys? Welcome to caleboni certified. Welcome back. Today we're going to be doing something slightly different from what we usually do. Today, for the very first time, we have a guest on this podcast interview thing. It's something we've never done on the channel, but for our guest today, we're making this happen. And our guest today is a senior AWS solutions architect with a number of years working in the cloud. He's also a content creator online with the YouTube channel Cloud Career Mentor, which is an e-learning provider that provides and helps cloud beginners to accelerate their careers in the cloud. Fayomi, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Caleb. I mean, I feel honored to be the first guest on here, and I'm really excited to speak to you today and see how the conversation goes.
Of course, of course. And let's get straight into it. And first things first, I just want to ask you to give a quick introduction about yourself, either personally and professionally, and just talk a little bit about yourself so we can get to know you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did an amazing job with the intro. So, hi everyone, my name is Fayomi. I'm a senior solutions architect with over 6 years of experience in AWS and in the cloud industry in general. And like you said, Caleb, about a year ago, I started a YouTube channel called Cloud Career Mentor. And the aim is to inspire, educate, and motivate people to get their first job in the cloud. And so I'm just here to spread that message as well.
Amazing, amazing. And to kick off, we want to start with asking that question of how you got into the cloud. I mean, you've spoken about your 6 years experience, so we can go back to the first few years of how you kind of made your way into this industry, and also why you chose this kind of industry over all the options that are out there in tech right now.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, when I got into the cloud or when I started learning technology, I didn't really know about the cloud industry because, let's fast forward to 6, 7, 8 years ago, the cloud was just starting up. It wasn't as big as it is now. And so at the time, all I knew was that I wanted to get a job in technology. It could have been IT support, it could have been whatever. I just wanted to get a job in there. And so I was talking to a friend at a barbecue, and he sort of advised me to start learning Linux because at this point I'd been playing around with Windows and Windows operating system and all of that. And he advised me to learn Linux, and I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. So I went home, opened up my computer, searched YouTube for Linux tutorials, and started learning the Linux command line. And, I found I really enjoyed it. And so, I did some Linux command line and I was like, okay, what's next? And the next thing was to create a web server because that's a common use case in Linux. So I created a web server and then I was like, oh, cool, this is cool. What's next? Next step is to host a web server. And that's how I actually got introduced to the cloud because the cloud is a great way or a great place to host web servers. And so, I created an AWS account, hosted my web server on there. And it was more of an iterative thing. So I never went into it thinking I wanted a cloud job. I knew I wanted a technology job, but I sort of stumbled into the cloud. I realized I really liked it. And then from there, applied for a bunch of roles and happened to get a job in the cloud as my first one. So that's how I stumbled into the cloud.
Amazing. And that's kind of similar for my kind of job search journey. I think at the beginning, not that it's been 6 years for me, but it's been a few years. And kind of at the beginning figuring out, what in tech I want to get into, and someone kind of who worked in cloud mentioning they work in that area, and me kind of thinking, oh, I need to look into that a bit more, learn a little bit about that online, and kind of ended up really going for that and getting a role in that area. So that's
Yeah.
amazing.
No, I think even to hop on with that, I think what you did was really good because, like I said, I got into it about 6 plus years ago. And I feel like
Yeah.
the cloud industry's changed a lot since then
Mm.
because back then there were less people who had the skills. So it was, I don't want to say it was easier, but the barrier to entry was lower. There weren't that many
Mm.
boot camps. People didn't really know about the cloud. Whereas now, like everybody wants to get into the cloud and it's a really hot industry. And so
Yeah.
the barrier to entry is a lot higher now. So I think with what you had, having someone who can sort of guide you and point you in the right direction is a real advantage.
Wow. Wow. That's great. And what areas would you say that this kind of cloud computing industry as a whole has really changed?
I'd say the first way it's changed is in the people available to do the work, right? So
Mm,
about 6 years ago, because there wasn't really that much knowledge about the cloud, so hiring managers didn't really know what they were looking for. And if you had sort of Linux skills and if you had an aptitude for technology, you stood a chance. Whereas
right,
now, because there's so many boot camps and knowledge, like there's just a lot more applicants who are applying for the same role. And so it means that you have to work even harder, right? So for example, with me when I was starting out, I knew Linux, I knew some programming, so I knew Python, and I knew some things. I wasn't a complete noob, but like I think now, if you're applying for jobs, you need to not only know Linux and all of that, but you also need to know sort of CI/CD, Git, some infrastructure as code tools like Terraform. You need to know a lot more. And not only do you need to know more, you need to also have demonstrable experience. So you need to be able to talk about, oh, I've done this project where I need A, B, and C.
yeah,
And I think that's what helps you to stand out really by having
yeah.
a lot more tools in your belt than, say, in the past people would have needed to have.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a really good answer. Another question I wanted to ask, since you've been working in cloud and you've gone through, different roles in the cloud, and one thing I wanted to ask is what you really sort of love about your job or about working in cloud, seeing as this is kind of the industry that you focused on in different roles in your career. What do you really love about cloud computing? If you don't love it, about this industry and working in this area.
I'll be honest, this industry's changed my life. And I think,
Wow.
the important thing is it pays really well. I'm just going to get that out of the way.
Mm,
It pays really well. And it's almost, it's not something where you go in and you're earning a lot of money. You might start out, I'd say in the UK, I usually tell people to expect between 30 and 40,000 starting
yeah,
salary, depending on sort of if they live in London or somewhere else and depending on a bunch of factors. But, I say that's pretty good, if you're just starting out because the
yeah,
average UK salary as a whole is about 30 to 32,000.
yeah,
So you're already starting out at a really decent place. But then as you start amassing experience, the salary actually goes up exponentially. So I think I was able to triple my salary in 3 years
wow, wow,
because the more senior you get, the less competition you have because there's a lot of people in the sort of junior role. But when you start getting higher and higher, there's not that many people who can do what you can do. But also because your responsibilities become more impactful, right? Because you're making architectural decisions. Your decisions can affect the entire trajectory of the business, right? So you get compensated for that. So the money is good, but also apart from that, I really enjoy working on interesting challenges. And
yeah,
when you're working in the cloud, a lot of the time you're working on the most cutting edge technology. So you're working on, like things like serverless or Docker, and you're just at the forefront a lot of the time, and also the opportunity to work with really smart people. Because
yeah,
again, because the barrier to entry in this industry is so high, a lot of the time the people you're working with are really smart as well because they've done what they needed to do to get here. And so the salary, working on cutting edge technology, and working
yeah.
with really smart people are the three things I really enjoy about working in the cloud
Amazing,
industry.
amazing. One of the things I kind of picked up on was the first thing you said about salary, and it's really interesting when I kind of talk about salary to people. People on the channel ask, what do you earn, or what exactly can I expect to make in this industry, and these kind of questions. I think for us, we're both in the UK, and
Mm,
in the UK, a lot of the time, you can't really compare it to when you see American salaries. I know a lot of the
yeah.
people that watch the channel are American, and the comparison between salaries in Europe and America, it can't really weigh up. And 30 to
Mm,
40K for someone who's either just left university or just got their first entry level role is a really good amount of money to start where we are.
yeah.
And obviously that is going to go up very quickly once you get some experience for a year or a few years. I think for me, you said your salary tripled within a few years. Mine, I've only been in this industry for 2 years and it's already doubled from my first role, which is incredible.
That's amazing. That's
And that's kind
amazing.
of the way it goes for a lot of people, from what I've heard and discussed, which is incredible.
And
Another
actually, if I could
question.
add to
Oh,
that as
sorry.
well,
Yeah.
because we're talking about between the UK and the US, but also there's a big discrepancy within the US. And something I've noticed a lot of the time in the media or with tech influencers, they always go for the highest amount, right? So when you see, salaries like this, it's usually in New York or San Francisco, right? And maybe that's where they're handing out these six-figure jobs. But the reality is, the reason you could get like 100,000 is because your cost of living is really high.
Mm,
So even though the salary sounds high, by the time you factor in your rent, your cost of living, your transport, all that money is gone. And so, what might be a six-figure job in New York, maybe in somewhere like, I don't know, Ohio, it's probably like a you know $50,000 job, right? So I think when we're looking at salaries and when we're having these conversations, it's always important to factor in, the context of it, sort of what area. If you're getting a job in a major city like London or New York or San Francisco, the salaries are going to naturally be higher than
mm.
if you're in like a smaller town or a smaller city. So I think when it comes to salary, that's something to bear in mind for sure.
Yeah, that's really good insight, and that will be really helpful for a lot of people, thinking about salary and how it kind of works. Another question that I kind of, thought about as you were talking was, about your kind of experiences moving from sort of an engineer when you started into sort of the architect roles. What is the major differences between those two roles? It would be really interesting to hear, what that is for you.
Yes. So when you're an engineer level, especially when you're junior to mid level, a lot of the times you're in the implementation world. So,
Mm,
someone decides this is what we're going to build, and then you need to build it. So whether
yeah.
you're building pipelines or you're building servers, but you're in the building phase. And so when you're, say, a beginner, you're just doing what you're told. Okay, build this, great, you build it, and you're excited. And then as you get to maybe the more mid-level engineer, like DevOps or cloud engineer, you might be making some decisions here and there, like, okay, I need to build this thing. Rather than building it this way, it's more efficient if I build it the other way, right? So you're starting to make, some decisions, but you're still in the implementation phase. When you become a solutions architect, a lot of the time you don't do that much implementation. Your time is spent around designing solutions, right? Making the decisions that then get implemented. And I think this is such an important thing to understand because I remember when I was an engineer, I was building stuff and I was like, oh, why do solutions architects get paid? I'm doing all the work, right? Because until you understand what the other person is doing, you can't really appreciate it. But then as I started to rise up, I realized that actually being a solution architect goes beyond the designing, right? Because a lot of work needs to come in before you sort of architect the solution. So, for example, you need to talk with all the stakeholders, so the developers, the product owners, the CTO, to first understand what's the problem, like what are we trying to achieve. So you gather all the information from everyone, you create into a document, get everyone to agree on that, like, okay, this is the problem. And then once you do that, then the next phase is to actually do some research and design solutions. So it's like, okay, what database are we going to use? What
Yeah.
computer are we going to use? Because understanding the differences, again, is very important. Should we go with a relational database or a NoSQL database? And
Yeah.
understanding the trade-offs of each. And this is very important. And then once you do that, then you have to get everyone of the stakeholders, go through all the solution with them, and then everyone has to agree. And a lot of times there's pushback, why are we using this? This is more expensive. And so you need to know how to communicate why you're choosing what you're choosing, and you need to do a lot of research. And so by the time you actually come to like drawing the diagram, like there's a lot
Mhm.
of work that has gone in, but
Yeah.
unfortunately a lot of the time people only see the diagram, that's the main output. So they think, oh, it's easy, just draw some diagrams, and why are you getting paid all this money? But I'd say that's the difference. And also a really important thing is that as a solution architect, if you get it wrong, the impact is a lot more. As an
Yeah.
engineer, if you get it wrong, usually you're working on only a piece of the puzzle, so it's relatively easy to fix. But as a solution architect, if you get the diagram wrong or the solution wrong, you might not find out till like 6 months later
Yeah.
when it's actually being implemented. And so it's much more difficult to roll back there. So
Right.
yeah, so that's just some of the differences between the responsibilities as you sort of rise through the ranks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's really interesting to hear from a solutions architect those differences and the responsibility that comes with being in that kind of senior role, the designing, the planning, the all the stuff that goes into that. So that's really interesting. Um, the next kind of question I wanted to ask was kind of to do with getting into cloud computing. So getting your
Mm,
first role in the cloud or as a cloud engineer or one of those entry level roles in cloud. And I wanted
mm.
to kind of hear your advice or your recommended steps to getting your first role in cloud computing. What would your recommended steps to achieving that be?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because I get asked this a lot because I mentor a lot of people and one of my key goals is to help more people get into the cloud. And what I've realized is there's a 5-step process that anyone can follow that will help them get that first cloud job. And it's one of those things where, I know what it's like to try and break into the cloud. You just want to learn one technology, then the other. One day you're learning Python, the next day you're learning Linux. Day three, you're trying to learn Kubernetes. And I find it's really easy to get lost in the weeds and to get confused. And so that's why I developed the 5 steps. And step number one is to get a learning plan. Because what happens if you don't have a learning plan is that you just get stuck on what I call a learning treadmill where you're learning all these things, but you don't feel like you're going anywhere because you're not getting deeper. So step one, get a learning plan. Step two, and for some context, here's the general order in which I tell people to learn things, right? One, learn Linux because Linux is the foundation to everything. If you can't do Linux, don't even bother. So learn the Linux command line, step one. Step two, get familiar with the AWS console and start doing some projects, right? Create some services, create something in S3 and EC2, just learn how it works. And once you do that, then you can then move on to more automation tools like Terraform, CI/CD, all of that stuff. So that's generally the order in which I'd say learn that. But again, we can go deeper into that later on. So step one, get the learning plan. Step two, master technology fundamentals. What do I mean? So let's say you're learning, let's say you're learning Linux, right? You need to understand, why is Linux important? Well, Linux is important because 90% of cloud workloads, at least in AWS, run on Linux. And the reason is because if you're working on a Linux terminal, you don't have the graphical user interface, which Windows does, which means that Linux, you can use a smaller instance type, which means it's basically cheaper. And so that's why a lot of companies use Linux. So understanding why the thing is how it is helps to contextualize it. But then you also need to learn the basic commands, right? So a lot of the times people try and go to complicated and complex immediately. They want to learn serverless straight away. It's like, no, learn something simple, right?
Mm.
So an example I give is a project where you have a WordPress server, right? Deploy WordPress on AWS, for example. And, so there's the simple way to do it, which is launch an EC2 in AWS. I'm sure Azure has its own terminology, but launch a virtual machine, install WordPress on it. And with WordPress, you need a database. You can also install the database on that virtual machine and just have it in a public subnet, configure it right, and just test that everything works. So I'd say that's the simple way to do it. So that's step two, step three, build simple projects. So
Mm.
after you build simple projects in that technology, and then move on to step four, which is build more advanced projects. So in the earlier example I gave, you had a WordPress server. It's all in like a public subnet to the database, WordPress, everything is
Yeah.
on the same server. So how can we make this complicated? Or I don't really like the word complicated. I'd say more of a real world example because most companies don't do it like this because it's not safe, it's not secure, it's not scalable. So let's say you built this simple project. Now, to make it more advanced, you then take other things into consideration. So how I'd do it is that I'd go, okay, now I need some public subnets and some private subnets. And then I'd create a virtual machine in the private subnet and install WordPress on it. But rather than having a database on the same virtual machine, I'd use a managed service. So in AWS, it'd be an RDS instance, and I'm sure Azure has its own managed services. So now you've decoupled the application, which is WordPress, from the database, right? So now they're decoupled, and again, the database is also in a private subnet for security. And what I then do is I put the virtual machine with the application in an auto scaling group so that, if it gets terminated, another one automatically spins up. And then I'd have an application load balancer in a public subnet. And so the traffic comes through the application load balancer and then into the WordPress virtual machine.
Right.
And the reason you do it like this is because this is how it's done in the real world, and it just makes your infrastructure more secure, more scalable, more resilient. But if you try to do this more complicated thing I mentioned off the bat, you'll get lost and you'll get confused. However,
Yeah.
if you build a simple project, which I mentioned earlier, you get to work out a lot of the kinks, right?
Yeah.
So, a lot of the simple things. So by the time you get to the more advanced project, what you're fixing is a bit different because you've already figured out a lot of things. So it just makes it easier to navigate. Whereas
Yeah.
what I see a lot of people do is try to do the complicated thing first and then get completely lost. And the final thing, so once you get, a couple of projects under your belt, so you've done some projects using AWS service, you've done some projects using CI/CD. So I'll give you another example of a simple and then advanced, right, with CI/CD. So a simple CI/CD thing is that, okay, you have some code, and then once you do a pull request and merge into a branch, it automatically gets deployed into a virtual machine, right? So that's really simple. You push your code, it gets deployed in a virtual machine. Great, using pipelines. However, in the real world, you might want to have a test environment and a
Mm.
production environment.
Yeah.
So you want to test the code, make sure everything works before it gets deployed in production. So a more complicated setup then, and a more realistic real world setup is now you have, let's say, two branches in your code repository. You have a test branch and a production branch. And then also in AWS or whatever cloud you also have two different servers, a test server and a prod server. So if you make a change to your code, you then merge it to your test branch, and then that deploys code to your test server. And then you
Right.
can do your test to make sure everything works. And then once you're satisfied, you can then merge that code from your test branch into your production branch, which then deploys that into the production server. So you can see again, we've gone from simple, where it's just one branch, one pipeline, to complicated. And by doing this, you then build up a repertoire of high quality projects you can talk about. Because again, there's a lot of competition. So the more you can do, the further you can take yourself, the more
Yeah.
likely an employer is going to look favorable on you. And so this brings us to the final step, which is learn how to communicate your experience. Now, this happens in two main ways. The first way is in your resume, right? You need to know how to write all the projects you've done, all your skills, all your experience in a way that sort of attracts recruiters. And I review a lot of people's CVs or resumes, and I see they don't really know how to do that properly. Either they don't have enough detail in there, or they have too much detail, or they're not formatting it properly. So learning how to communicate your experience on paper is really good.
Yeah.
And then the second way is through interviews, right? So once you actually start getting calls from recruiters, how do you talk about the projects you've done? Like, Caleb, you'd be surprised how many people I have mock interviews with, and I'm like, okay, so tell me about the projects you've done, and they're going, I can't remember, and then they don't have an answer for me. And
Yeah.
this is a question that's definitely going to come up in an interview, right?
Yeah.
So you need to know how to respond to that. You need to practice. You need to know what the common interview questions are and how to answer them confidently and
Yeah.
competently, right? With a smile on your face and with enthusiasm. So these are, I'd say, by following these five things. So just to iterate, because I know I've said a lot of things.
Yeah.
Step one, get a learning plan. Step two, master technology fundamentals. Step three, build simple projects. Step four, build advanced projects. Step five, communicate your experience. And that's the 5-step framework to get your first cloud job.
That is a really good framework, and I'm sure the people watching this who are trying to get that first cloud job will really be able to take a lot from those 5 steps that you've just shared. One of the things that I was really interested with was when you spoke about the basic project and then into the sort of advanced project. The basic one was quite simple, create a VM, install WordPress, get a database behind it. And the second one was kind of building that in a way that kind of looked like the real world, having a test environment, production environment, and kind of pushing that through as if it was a company doing so, or as if it was real life. So
Mm.
these steps were really good, and it's really great to hear sort of a framework that people can just go along with and follow to getting their first role. So I hope those watching and who are looking to get their first role can really take a lot from this. And at some point, we'll have to do an Azure version with sort of the Azure sort of technology. So I know so many people on here are very Azure focused and AWS focused as well. But yeah, that is really helpful. Um, Another thing I wanted to kind of ask you, whilst we have you, is about sort of the content you share on Cloud Career Mentor,
Mm.
and the insights that you share online. I wanted to really just ask you, what inspired you to sort of share these insights to sort of help people try and get into the cloud, and how have you kind of found that content creation experience as well?
That's a great question because the reason I actually got started creating content is out of almost a bit of anger in a way or frustration because when I work in, almost every cloud role I've ever worked in, the number one problem employers have is finding talented cloud engineers. Like they're always looking. They're like, we need people, we need people. However, I noticed that, by speaking to a couple of people who were trying to get into the cloud, like they weren't really successful. I noticed there were a lot of people trying to break into the cloud, but they weren't really successful and they didn't know why. And so, I started getting on calls with people to find, okay, what have you been doing? What's going on? And I realized that there was a huge gap between what a lot of quote unquote tech influencers were saying and the realities of the industry. So, for
Yeah.
example, you'd have some tech influencers saying, oh, all you have to do is get, 2 certifications and you could just walk into a 6-figure jobs. Everyone's hiring. And so people were going in with the wrong expectations. And so they're like, oh, but I have my certifications. Why am I not getting jobs? And I'm like, okay, cool. What projects have you done? And it's like, and I don't blame them because that's what they've been told, right? And again, there's some incentives in the industry. You kind of, everyone's seen a day in the life video where it's, they work at Amazon and they're getting coffee like 3 times a day. And you're like, do you actually do any work here? And so, yeah, I just thought I'd bring a more realistic view because again, my aim is to actually help people to get jobs because it's changed my life. And
Yeah.
with the people I've helped, it's also changed their life too. And I know by just making some simple tweaks, by putting in, because a lot of the people I spoke to, they're ready to put in the work, right? But they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
They don't know because no one's telling them. And so that's why I decided to set up Cloud Career Mentor. And, a lot of my content is, I should almost reframe it to be like, are you sure you want to get into cloud? Because, I tell people the truth. I'm like, this isn't easy, but if you can do it, it's very rewarding. I recently had one of the students in my program. She was able to transition from being a nurse to a cloud engineer.
Wow.
And she'd been trying for like a year or so. She paid a lot of money for a boot camp.
Yeah.
But again, with the reality is they didn't show her the right things. They gave her the foundations, which were great because you do need some certifications just to get your head around it. But, when it came to actual like projects and things, they were lacking. And
Mm.
yeah, so 6 months after joining the program, she was able to get her first job like the week before Christmas, which
Wow.
for me was great because week before Christmas, there were a lot of layoff news going on.
Yeah.
So I was really happy for her. And, I've seen other people do the same trajectory. So that's long story short. That's why I started this because I wanted to get the real information out there. And on my channel, loads of free content on my LinkedIn, on my YouTube. So people can check that out if they're interested.
Definitely, definitely. Cloud Career Mentor, guys. Just type into YouTube, you'll find it. And LinkedIn as well. I've been seeing a lot of the posts that have been coming from your LinkedIn sort of page, which are really interesting and helpful insights as well. So that's been
Thank you
great
very
also.
much.
Yeah, so you mentioned certifications, which is great. A great segue
Mm,
into the next question, which we will kind of talk about. And I wanted to ask you how you feel about certifications, as well as how they are perceived and how useful they really are to professionals. I know
mm.
there's been a lot of um, talk amongst influencers, some being like, just get a couple certifications and get into the industry. That's all you need. And others really saying certifications aren't really the way to do that. They're not valuable. They're not this. And what is your kind of thoughts on that? Um, that kind of, yeah, what the usefulness of
Yeah.
certifications.
So you know me, Caleb. I'm all about the nuance, right?
Yeah.
Because the reality is, I used to play a lot of chess growing up,
Mm,
and on a chessboard there's different pieces, right? You have the rook, you have the bishop, you have the knight, and in chess the pieces are important depending on what stage you are in the game. So at the beginning of the game, when the board is all cluttered, the knight is more useful because it can jump over pieces. But
mm,
then as the game opens up, it becomes less valuable, and then the bishop becomes more important. So all of this to say is that when we talk of certifications, hands-on skills, all of these things, just think of them as pieces in a chessboard, right? So I'd say at the start of your career,
yeah.
certifications are, I'd say you need one or two, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know what the Azure ones but in AWS you need the cloud practitioner certification, which is like the beginner one. Like this is one, I wouldn't even say it's a technical one. It's like
Yeah.
it tells you what a cloud is, what the main services are, like it's
Yeah.
entry. But I'd say you need the AWS Solutions Architect Associate certification. Now this goes more in depth about the services and what you can do with them. Anything else, I'd say stop there. You have enough certifications. Now focus on your hands-on skills, all of that. So I'd say for a beginner, get those two certifications. And I'm sure with Azure, it's the same. There's probably one or two you need. But
Yeah.
after that, hands-on becomes more important. That being said, once you actually get the job and you've been in the job for like a year or two, then I'd say go hard on the certifications,
Mm.
get as many as you can,
Wow.
because again, I always think of, I'd say think of your career in stages, right? So again, you have your entry level or junior, you have your mid level, and you have your senior, right? And for you to get more senior, you need to have more detailed knowledge about the different services because like I say, you're going to be making decisions. So you need to know the intricacies of how each works. And that's where certifications come in because then you can dive deeper into those. So actually, once you get your job, you have a year or two under your belt. Now start focusing on certifications because then that's building you up to becoming more of a solutions architect. And so to answer your question, I'd say it's not that if certifications are useful or not useful, but they have a place. At the
Yeah.
start of your journey, get one or two, and then once you actually have a job, then you can really dive in. And something a lot of people don't tell you, so this is breaking news, Caleb, right here.
Mm.
A lot of the times your employer will actually pay for you to do the certification,
Yeah.
both the training and the certification fee. So because they're incentivized to do it because, it gives them more status with the AWS or with Azure. And there's other reasons. So again, there'll be time for certifications.
Yeah. That's some really good insight. And I completely agree. Like from my point of view, I needed to get a few certifications to be where I am early in my career. I think, the first, well, for Azure, obviously different from AWS. I did the cloud practitioner kind of at some point just to learn a little bit about AWS. But for me, getting started with Azure, the AZ 900 Azure Fundamentals was the place to start if you're
Mm,
going to get into Azure. And from there, it's a bit different because there's no guaranteed yet this is what you do next. Like with AWS, most people say do the AWS cloud solutions. What is it? Associate.
yeah, that's it.
For Azure, there's quite a few different ones. I think the ones that I've looked at personally, the AZ 500 Azure Security Associate, or the AZ 104 Azure Administrator, which is what I did. It was kind of my second certification whilst I was already working in cloud. And so it is important to get those initial kind of certifications, which is just a great way to give you kind of a structured understanding of the cloud, along with the projects as well. It's not a thing of learning the theory without practicing it and playing around with the portal and doing projects and this kind of thing. You need a balance of those two getting in. And then I'm excited to see what takes place in my career, going in 2 years and beyond, in terms of certifications. There's many more certifications I'm looking to take and looking to learn a lot more about. So your advice has been helpful in affirming my the reason that I'm doing that. So I really appreciate it.
Definitely. I think you're on the right track. And also thanks for mentioning what the Azure equivalents are, because again, I
Yeah,
think that'll be really helpful to your listeners.
definitely. Naomi, thanks so much for joining. Before we end this off, I wanted to give you an opportunity to shout out and share your kind of platforms and things that you'd want to promote. So yeah,
Yes, so actually, I have a free gift for your listeners, if that's okay.
yeah, of course.
So while I was on this journey, I've actually created a free guide of the 3 steps, they need to take to get a job in the cloud. And it's basically summarizing a lot of what we've spoken about here. So this is something they can reference at a later date. And, I'll send it to you and hopefully you can just pop that in the
Yeah,
description. They can get that. Another thing as well, again, if you're interested, just search Cloud Career Mentor on YouTube, or if you're more of an audio podcast person, which I am as well, just search Cloud Career Mentor on whatever your podcast hosting thing is, and yeah, we'll pop up. But yeah, no,
amazing.
I'm really glad to be able to speak to your people, and hopefully they've gotten a ton of value from this.
Definitely. I know everyone watching would have gotten so much value from this. And just an FYI for everyone watching, this has been kind of a double collaboration. So if you go to Cloud Career Mentors YouTube channel, you'll see me on there at some point as well. Whichever one comes out first, whichever editor is faster, um, is whichever video. Either this will be out first or Violin's
Link
will
in
be out.
description. Check
Link
that
in
out.
description and out at some
Yeah.
point in this video. So thanks so much for watching. And this has been such a great podcast, Fahmy. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.